All right, so Chapter 8 is on how to work with state, cookies, and URL encoding. The beginning of the chapter is going to sound very similar to stuff that we've already gone over. In fact, some of it will sound very similar to stuff that we've gone over, but they look at the idea of state in more depth and breadth of coverage than we've looked at. All right? Now, believe it or not, that first sentence is one of the most important. Much of the stuff that you have to do with state, when you talk about view state, you're talking about being able to do the equivalent of taking a snapshot in time and looking at the values of variables, etc., and be able, and it's even more than that, it's being able to take information and share it between different pages in a site. Does that make sense? And that doesn't matter if it's ASP.NET, that you do it in PHP, you do it in virtually any language. One of the things that kind of distinguishes client from server is with server, it's much easier because you're working with state to do that than with any client-side code. So they say you don't have to set any of the properties or write any of the code to use it. That's somewhat true. But if you want to be able to, it's like anything else. If you plan on doing some work on your car and all you ever want to do is change the oil, you probably don't have to know very much. But if you decide you want to tune it up yourself or do other things, you're going to have a little bit more knowledge. And the same way here. You probably have heard that old saying, knowledge is power type of an idea. Well, the more you understand this, the more you're going to be able to naturally do with it. Now, we did talk about this in a much earlier chapter, this thing with underscore view state. All right, it says view state works by saving data in an HTML stream that's sent to the browser. So, do they show it? No, of course not. All right. But in this underscore view state variable, it's got encrypted basically all of the information, involved in the program. So as it says there, it's an ASP.NET feature that provides for retaining the values of page and control properties that change from one execution of a page to another. So as you're going through it, for instance, if we decided that what we wanted to do, and I don't remember, I guess we did do that for the BMI one, all right? It's much easier to be able to use view state to pass information back and forth between those pages. Anytime you're doing anything with totals and the like, it's pretty much going to be a necessity. All right, I don't want to read that, but you can see the stuff that's in there. Now notice view state is not used to restore data entered by a user into a text box unless the control responds to change events. All right, so in other words, if you remember, we had that if not is postback thing that we always been putting at the top. And what are we checking? Well, remember in that when we did the program for future value, we only wanted to fill the values that were in that drop-down list once because they're never going to change. So occasionally you will have code, you will have stuff that is server-side stuff, but you'll never want it to change. Now, when the user might change a different option that's in it, and again, you know this. So we had that drop-down list, and if you remember, we had what? Like it was like 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500, all right, in the drop-down list. And every time you changed, then you had to send a message back to the server because it had to know that the value that you selected changed. But that said, those values themselves never changed, all right? So you should, really try not to duplicate, not to make the server do work when it doesn't have to. And for lack of better words, that's kind of what they're saying here. Now, what you can do, because sometimes when you work with view state, it can really slow a system down. And you may not have to have view state enabled for everything. If you're working on a very, very complex application, all right, you might have, literally you could have 20, 30 controls on there. And if you had 30 controls and let's say 2/3 of them were ASP.NET controls, view state is being kept for all 20 of those. You may not need it to be enabled for all 20 of them because, as I said, it can really slow down performance. So, for that reason, as they mention here, you can disable it. And it's like anything else. Virtually anything else that's in ASP.NET, you've got your choice of disabling it in 3 ways. You can disable it for a certain control. So let's say that you've got a button and you know for whatever reason you want it disabled. So you can disable it just for that button. Or you can disable it for an entire page. So just the page on that site, not every page. Or you can do it, you can basically do it for the entire site if you wanted to do that. All right, so it's up to you. Now it says, although ViewState was designed to automatically save, you can also decide to save your own things into it. It's a little bit hinky, for lack of better words, because the way that they work with it, they end up using something that's called the state bag. And I'm not positive, but I think this is old. And when I say it's old, the state bag and view state bag, this is stuff that's been around for years. And as things have gone on in time and it's gotten more sophisticated, a lot of this stuff has been saved. And I think it's been saved because some of the people who were using it back in the olden days, like in the 90s and the 2000s, are still using it. All right. But when you look at this, and it gets a little confusing, but I just want you to realize it when you look. I would never ask you to do this. But as an example, if you look at these 2 lines that are right here, and this is from page 281 in the book, those 2 lines both are doing the same exact thing. But they're showing you that there's 2 different ways that you can either add an item to ViewState or update an existing item. You can use it here in the second example almost like it's an array. And you can use it here like you're working with a property. So you can do it more in an object-oriented and in a non-object-oriented way. And if you raised your hand and you said, well, which way's better? There really and truly is no difference. To my knowledge, there's no time difference. There's no any kind of difference. So why would they give you 2 ways of doing it? Because quite often, and you know this in software, you're given more than one way of doing the same thing. Some people are very comfortable, competent, capable of treating things like properties. Others like to use it in the array format, but it doesn't matter which one you use. I would say be consistent. Pick one or the other that you like and use it that way. All right. Again, I've said this to you before. You're never impressing me when, if there's 8 ways to do everything and I give you 9 things to do, you do all 8 of them. Even if you do them right, you're not impressing me. I'd rather have you pick 1 way or 2 ways that make the most sense to you and use those. All right. I just think that, again, that's just common sense. The other thing, when you realize this, is when you work with ViewState, it can appear either on the left-hand side of an equal sign or on the right-hand side of an equal sign. But you'll notice that when it appears on the right-hand side of an equal sign, quite often you're going to have to do casting. And that's what they're showing on here. So again, I don't want to sit and read this stuff to you. I'm just trying to hit you with the high points. All right? So that's how you add it. That's how you retrieve it. There's how you remove it. I don't think there's a master remove command that removes everything. You know, you've kind of seen this before, like when we're working with things with the items class where you can say items.clear. I don't believe there's anything like that in here. I could be wrong. I don't remember ever seeing anything like that. All right, so that's ViewState. All right, so you can also use session state. And people say, well, that's fine. Why would I use session state as opposed to ViewState? Because when you use session state, by and large, it seems to, at least, it lasts longer. It's made to last longer. Whenever you go in, for example, if I was showing the students this morning, and I'm not going to do it with you now, you've seen this kind of thing before, but if I go into Amazon and I start putting stuff into a shopping cart, what I'm doing is I'm starting up a session. Does that make sense? Now you have to be real leery about that because, you know, I think I've mentioned this to you before, that when I create this session, or when this session's created for me is a better way of putting it, a session ID is generated. And that's like 40 characters of letters and numbers that are all unique, okay? But one thing I have to make sure of is when I'm doing that, is that over time, it's not impossible that somebody could try to literally get online and figure out my session ID. So what a thing like Amazon quite often does is while you're in a session, it'll go and it'll basically say, okay, regenerate a new ID. It's your same session, but it generates a new ID so that if somebody is able to steal it, they've got the old copy and it's no longer active. Does that make sense? And it's really important because Amazon's one of those things, you know, before or this morning, I went and put something into the cart. Now I got rid of it later, but I would, you know, put money on it. It would still be in there otherwise, right? It does that. All right. And there is a session that's set up for that. And that's what they talk about. It says basically anytime you start doing something new, it creates a session state object that has a unique session ID. And they go through a little bit of this, but it looks in many ways, it's not exactly the same, but in many ways, it's very similar to what we just looked at for the view state stuff. The difference is you have actually a little bit more control over session state than you do over view state. View state is designed to automatically save stuff for you. And even though you can add your own stuff to it, most people don't. Most of the time, if people want to go and be able to customize things, they use session state. All right? Just like you saw before, and it can appear on either side of the equal sign, you've already been dealing with this. We looked at some of the stuff with session state before. All right? I'm going to go back in between tonight and tomorrow, but hopefully tonight, I'm going to go in and look at, you know, writing your next test. You may not even need all 4 hours for your next test. You may be able to do it in an hour or two. And I'm not just saying that, because much of the stuff that's in it, we've already done. All right, we already did on the previous test. I mean, if I say I'm going to give you 4 hours and what I want you to do is add these check boxes and these radio buttons, you're not going to need 4 hours to do that. All right. So again, if you want more,
What do you mean by a non-page class that retrieves a state?
Where-
Session state item from
where are you?
in the bold, in that list where it's showing you the adds, retrieved, removed.
In here?
Yeah, the last one.
Last one.
What's that mean? What do they mean
A
by
statement that receives a session state item from a non-page class.
that? What's the application there?
My guess is that's an external variable that's not involved with the page directly, but I'm not sure. Okay, and it may even be mentioned in here. I don't know. All right. So I don't think it's something that's directly related to the web form itself, is what I'm saying. Now, I almost wish that the author had mentioned this before we went through the examples in one of the previous chapters, because notice what they say here. Most ASP.NET developers use session state in a consistent or almost the same way. First, you retrieve data from the session state and you store it in variables. Then you use the variables to process the user events. Finally, you save the updated variables. Does that sound familiar? That's the same thing you did. All right. And again, for whatever reason, the author decided to show it to you like this now, or put it in now. He did. All right. Now, it is a little bit more complex, and it's going to start getting a little bit more complex because, for example, when you look at the example here, and you can see it a little bit in yellow, you'll notice it's got here private cart item list cart. Cart is going to be much more complex. In other words, it's not an int, it's not a double, etc. It's not a string. It's an object that can conceivably contain a lot of different strings and ints and floats, etc. And that's what we're going to be getting into more. All right? So that's what they start talking about. It says here, cart equal cart item list dot get cart. Well, look at it this way. What they're telling you is, for lack of better words, okay, I want to know what currently is in my cart. What product have I ordered? How many of them have I ordered? Etc. Does that make sense? Because rather than, if I'm going to order 15 things, it's the difference between giving me one order with 15 things in it and 15 orders each with one thing in it. All right, that would be silly to do. And if I was going to be, imagine you're Walmart and you have to do that. That would never work. All right, they want to be able to order probably millions of different things and put them all in the same order. And that's what they're talking about here. A click handler that updates the cart object. All right, in English, if cart.count equals 0, well, cart.count will only be greater than 0 if there actually has been a cart that's been created. All right, so if it's not, it says please select the item you want to remove. So in this case, since it's in remove, there's nothing to remove. You do the count and there's nothing in there. So imagine, again, with what they were talking about before with the Halloween Superstore. You may or may not remember, but when you're on the cart page, there is one thing that says remove item, which is just designed to remove whatever item you've got highlighted, and there's one that says clear cart, which removes everything. So let's say that you clicked remove cart and there's nothing in there. Your cart's already empty. All you're doing is you got to give them a message. That's all. Okay? All right. And here it's the same thing. So here you're saying, is there even a cart? And if there's a cart, is there a count? In other words, I want to select something. So this if actually doesn't have an else. This else goes with this if. So let's take it from the top. I go in, and here's my cart. All right, let's just say I've got in here, I don't remember what there was. There was like a smoke machine. All right, let's say I've got one of those, and it's $49.99. All right, well, then my cart.count, it is greater than 0. Everybody agree with that? So we get into here. Is my selected index greater than -1? Well, what that means is, if I click here, remove, and in fact it was over here. There was remove item, and there was like a clear cart. And what they're talking about here is that remove item. Well, if I have not highlighted this, but I click remove item, there's nothing to remove. Does that make sense? Because I haven't highlighted it. So it says, you better highlight something. All right. On the other hand, if I have highlighted it, so let's just imagine that's highlighting, and I click the remove item, then my selected index will be greater than -1. If it's the first item, it's 0, etc. Then it'll remove it, and it'll redisplay the cart. Does all that make sense? It sounds pretty complex, but when you see it in action, you're like, yeah, it just makes sense. But again, remember, you're dealing with a computer. It's real easy for you and I to figure out what's happening, but you've got to be very specific in what you tell the computer. And that is what the author is talking about in here. You only need to update a session state item explicitly if it's stored in a value type variable like an integer. If it's stored in a reference type variable, in other words, if it's in a class, all right, it'll automatically be updated. So when we do this and we say remove at and display, boom, it shows it, and now that's going to be gone. What they're saying is there's nothing special that you have to do, all right, to make it leave. All right. Options for storing session state data and for tracking IDs. There are different ways, what they're saying here, that this can be done. And again, since you're not being tested on this stuff, let's just very quickly go over it. All right. First way, as it says there, it's in process. Stores the data in IIS server memory. It's the default, but if you have several servers, Amazon couldn't do this. If you make a very complex order in Amazon, there's nothing to say that you're not going to be serviced by more than one server. All right. In fact, if you're ordering from multiple different companies, I could almost guarantee that you were going to be being served by more than one server. All right. So this wouldn't work for that. For what we're doing, it'll work because it's just us. It's what we've got anyway, etc. And it's the simplest way of doing it. All right. Then there's state server, as it says. It stores it in server memory under the ASP.NET state service. It can be accessed by other servers, so it can be used when the application is hosted on a web farm. So that's better. All right. Then you've got SQL server. Anytime you see SQL Server, you should start thinking it's going to store stuff into a database. And that's exactly what happens there. All right. Notice it's slower than in process and state, but it's the most reliable. Because if for some reason there's a problem, you still have it in the database. Here, if you're using one of these two and somehow something gets hosed, you get a lightning strike or whatever, you could lose things. All right, you can lose things much easier. The only other alternative is to write your own stuff. And maybe you feel like you could do that. I don't feel like I'm knowledgeable enough to do that. All right. One of the reasons I was late is, David Markowitz, the counselor, he came in and decided he wanted to talk. And I told him twice. I said, I'm already late for my class. And then he's like, no, I got some information for you. And he gives it to me. And he's telling me that when I really want to impress people, if I want to really make a point, I'm supposed to do it like this. I don't, he's telling me this, and I'm like, I just want to get the hell out of here and get into class. I don't want to hear you talk about anything. All right? Okay. Now, they talk about two options for tracking session IDs. There's cookie-based and there's cookie-less. And we're going to talk about cookies in a minute. And, again, no jokes. You know what cookies are. All right? But the thing is, when you talk about things being cookie-based, one thing to realize is users can disable cookies. All right? And if they have their cookies disabled on their computer, it can be darn near impossible for the cookie-based option to work. Okay? Then you've got cookie-less, and it says the session ID is coded as part of the URL. Well, what they don't tell you is typically when you use cookie-less, there is a special cookie that even if you've got cookies turned off, you can still use. All right? And I don't mean to confuse you, but I just wanted you to hear that. Now it says attributes of the session state element in web.config. Well, you may or you may not remember this, but I wanted to show you something here. That every time you create a program, what automatically gets created for you is this file called web.config. And if you look underneath it, there's other stuff in it, a debug and a release. But if I open this, anytime you hear web.config, these are the system settings. So if I wanted to turn something off site-wide, I do it in here. One of the ways we could have worked with unobtrusive validation that it would always have been set would have been to come in and do it in here. All right. Again, I don't know how familiar or comfortable you are with this. I'm not. I have looked at it. I've worked with it a little bit. All right. But I try not to use it if I can help it. So these are the things in there that you can set. The mode, which is one of the ones we looked at before. Cookie-less, which we just talked about. Timeouts. Notice it says the minutes that a session should be maintained without any user activity. So if you haven't used it for 20 minutes, by default, the session goes away. And that's done to protect you. You can up that. You can literally have a session that'll last an infinite amount of time. It'll last forever if you want to do that. All right. Now, and the idea with 20, just so you know what it comes from, is that with most programs, with most client-side programs, if you're working with something and you generate a session ID and you get out, it keeps that session ID active for 20 minutes, just in case you want to log back in. That's where I believe that 20 minutes or that 20 comes from. All right. The state connection, again, these are different things that you can set. This one right here, that one will be important, the SQL connection string, in a couple weeks when we start to get into the database stuff. Okay. If there is one advantage over Ms. Zika not calling is by the end of the week, hopefully we'll be done with Chapter 9. And if she does call this week and says, can you start next week? I'll say no, but we can start the following week, and then we'll be done with Chapters 1 through 11. All right, so. All right. In contrast to session state, which stores data for a single user session, application state and caching allow you to store data stored by all users. Typically, what cache is, C-A-C-H-E, what cache is it's a special part of memory that, depending on how it's set up, and I think I've given you this example before, that if I go out to CNN.com and I bring it up in my browser, all right, even if, what happens is it grabs what's in that page, it caches it, so it copies it to my memory. If I close it and bring it up again 30 seconds later, it's going to probably go and grab it from cache, not from CNN's site. The reason for that is it can grab it a lot faster. Now, you can play with this stuff because, for example, if I take a snapshot of if I go out to Amazon right now and I want to buy a book and it says there's only one copy of this book left, and I come out there, let's say 5 minutes later, there's at least a chance that book could be gone. Would you all agree with that? All right. A lot more than the stuff that we're doing. So they mentioned, it says here, Figure 8.6 presents the concepts you need for working with application state and caching. To start with, an application is made up basically of your project. Okay? Now, what gets confusing about that, it says it can be made up of all the pages of code and the other files located under a single directory in an IIS web service. One thing we don't do here, but you can do if you look up on the screen here, all right, this is our solution. I think you all know that. This is our project. I think you all know that. I can right mouse click on here and I can choose add, and one of the things I can add is another project in here. All right, and you might say, why would you ever want to do that? Well, what if I had a project and let's say that part of my project I was going to have a very complex login process. That might be one project that's in my solution, and then once I get in, then I've got the rest of it in my solution. Does that make sense? All right. But I'm just telling you, we don't go, I've never built another project, a solution that has more than one project in it. I've opened a couple and looked at them, and that's normally what I just mentioned to you is the kind of way that it's set up. Now they go into a lot of detail here, but let's just take a look at a couple of the concepts that they mention. An application begins when the user first requests a page that's part of the application. ASP.NET initializes the page before it processes the request for the page. I've mentioned this to you before, that if you go and you run that trace that we talked about back in Chapter 5, what you're going to find out is as you go through your project, it go literally, ASP.NET might go through 20, 30, 40 different states. And it might iterate between different states, go back and forth between them. So they explain what's happening here, and again, it's pretty heavy stuff. And then they also talk about what cache is and what application state is. The reason that this can become important is if I want something special to happen, every time my program starts, but only when that program starts. Remember when we did this and we talked about this before in our first test? And I think the only one who got that right originally was Evan, because he put that variable in there. Remember you had that string that you put the letter A in? Well, another way of doing that, and you'll see it in just a minute, is to create what's called a global.asax class, because that global.asax class has in it a special method called application_start. And if you add that, and then you've got that method available to you, that method is supposed to run before anything else happens. So if there's something you want to have happen at the beginning, but only happen once, that's where you can put the code in. To me, and I'm saying this not asking for any sympathy or anything else, part of my job, my charge, is to figure out if there's even anything in here I can put in your next test. I'm going to look at it tonight, and if I decide, you know what, there's nothing I can add in here, there's really and truly nothing I can add from Chapter 8, then what we might do is tomorrow we might go right into Chapter 9, and then your test will be on basically Instead of being on 7 and 8, it'll be on 7 and 9. Okay, I'll have to look at it tonight. My first reaction is that's probably what I'll do. There's just, I mean, state can be very complex. All right, this is a little more of what I just mentioned to you, working with these application events. For you first, add a global.asax file to the project using one of the techniques. So you do that, and these are what you get automatically. So you're saying whenever the application starts, so it says when the first page of the app is requested by any user, it's often used to initialize values. All right, as opposed to end, when the application is about to terminate. It says it can be used to write the values. Yeah, it's more or less, for lack of better words, it's used for housekeeping purposes. So if you've got a file open, you close it. If you've got a database open, you close it. On the other hand, you also get session start and session end. All right, just because the application is started doesn't mean you've necessarily started a session. Okay, just because, well, if the application is about to end, yeah, well, one of the things it says it's when the session is about to terminate, not when the program is about to terminate. So these are program dependent or application dependent. These two are session dependent. It's not at all inconceivable that you could start up a session, do some stuff, close that session, start up another session. All right, it's totally possible, plausible that you could do that. So again, if you do create that global ASAX file, these are what you get by default. Now, you'll notice that they don't even show in here the session end because you're not doing anything. All right, so you don't even need to have that one in there. And the example that they give here, this is actually a really good example. It's making sure that on your Halloween Superstore, it's got a hit counter. So as soon as you start that up, it says you're the 367th visitor to visit this site. All right, you get out, you get back in again, you're now the 368th visitor. The system doesn't know if you get out and you get back in again that you're the same user, and it doesn't care. All right, it's kind of funny because I've seen people do this before. When they want to start to generate site traffic, they keep going out to their site. And yes, that does generate site traffic, but if you go out to things like Google Analytics, it tells you whether or not all of I've said this to you before. I got 500 hits. Oh, did you get one hit from 500 different machines or 500 different hits from the same machine? There's a big difference. All right. It's like years ago, one of the instructors that I worked with at Blackhawk, was getting really terrible reviews, which I couldn't understand because I never saw her in the classroom. But she's a very nice person. So she went out to ratemyprofessor.com about 50 times herself and was writing good reviews. Now, it was a very stupid package that didn't have analytics. So all of a sudden, her rating went up from a 2 to like a 4.5 out of 5. All right, and they didn't realize that they were all coming from her ISP. And they were all coming from her. All right, because it's all done anonymously anyway. She was, it was funny because I said, why are you doing that? She's like, oh, wouldn't that bother you? I said, no, look at mine. I got negative reviews out there. You think everybody's going to like you? All right, so they show you how you can add that global ASAX file. The easiest way to do it is to come in here, as we've done before, right mouse click, choose add, new item, and I think you've got to look in here, but one of the things that's in here is the global, and I know it's in here someplace, all right? But they do show you the ways of doing it in here, all right? Okay. Oops. Oh, that was neat. How did I jump there? what happens when you lose your page. All right. So, how to use cookies and URL encoding. Okay. A cookie is a name value pair. Okay. If I told you right now, let's see if we can grab a word from here that. There you go. If I said right now, hey Brady, what does instantiate mean? And let's just assume Brady didn't know. All right. Well, in the old days, you know, like back when I was your age, we would have this thing called a dictionary. Okay, and it was this big, thick book, and you'd have to page through it, and you'd find the I's, and eventually you'd find instantiate, and boom, you'd get it. Now you go out to dictionary.com, you type in instantiate, and it gives you a much better definition than I ever got. But the point is, the key would be instantiate. The value would be the definition of instantiate. Does that make sense? All right, and that's what they're talking about in here. So when you create a cookie, there are a lot of things that you can add to it, but there's only one or two that you must add to it. A couple things about cookies, just so you hear it if you haven't already. Cookies are basically text files that a server writes to a client. They're not executable. All right. You can actually look at them in Notepad. Bring them up in Notepad. Okay. And typically they get logged, and that just makes me think that, when people always say, well, can somebody really find out like my habits online and what sites I've been to, etc.? A lot of that stuff is saved in cookies, directly or indirectly. Some personal information is saved in cookies. All right. Amazon remembers if I go out there today and I look for a book on HTML5, all right, whether I put it in my cart or not, if I come back tomorrow, it's going to show me that same book that I was looking at, and then it'll also say people who bought this book also bought the following, or also looked at the following. That's all done basically through cookies. All right. Cookies work with HTTP cookie class. There are some examples. All right. They're setting a session ID. That's the kind of thing a session ID will look like. And it's oftentimes bigger than that. But you can set cookies for literally anything you want to. When you set a cookie, you must give it a name and you must give it a value. But that's all you have to give it. You see the other stuff that's in here, expires, secure, etc. You don't have to do that. If you don't, there are defaults that it will follow. But the system expects that a cookie is going to have a name. All right, and it also expects it's going to have some kind of value. All right. Now, when you go through, notice in here, you're like, well, this doesn't have a value. No, we're creating a session cookie. And notice they talk about a session cookie and a persistent cookie. A session cookie typically will end when the session ends. It'll automatically go bye-bye. All right, it's set up to do that. A persistent cookie will it'll last even after the session is ended. So notice that cookie will end a year from now. There's literally nothing to stop you right there from putting 1,000 in there. And technically that will be up and running for 1,000 years. All right. If you want a cookie to be removed, for instance, if I came here and changed this to -1, that's saying last year. All you have to do to get rid of a cookie is set what's called its expiry time, to set it to a time that's already passed. All right, then the cookie's gone. Now, when is this stuff? Why is this stuff important? This stuff is mostly important when you're working with things like shopping carts. I can't imagine a situation where we would have to worry about working with session state, working with cookies, etc., if we do that project for the St. Charles County Economic Development Council. The only way that would be is if they needed proof of who was on the system and who made this change at what time. Boy, and that would be a lot of code. If they're looking for that, they're probably looking for the wrong people to do it. All right. because whoever's going to do that for them, they're going to charge them lots of money. All right, there's not going to be a bunch of students doing it to try to get some experience. So again, a cookie is a name value pair. A session cookie kept in the browser's memory and exists only for the duration of the browser session. One thing to realize, okay, if you all look up here, not this is a big thing, but I just want you to realize it. Okay, okay. So I go out here. I'm out at Amazon, right? I come in and I open this up again. I don't realize I even have it open. And now I'm out on Amazon again. So that's two different sessions. There are two different session IDs with that. The system isn't smart enough to know that that's me and that's me. Okay? That doesn't mean that if I put something into here, into my cart, and I go to the other one, it'll probably show as being in there. But technically, there are two different sessions. All right? And we talked about this in an earlier class. It's because HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, is what's called stateless. It doesn't know that it's the same user. All right? And it doesn't care that it's the same user. It handles it as though it's two different users. We're going to finish this, and we'll take a good long break. All right, so working with cookies, not a whole lot you can do with them. All right. Notice you can get a count of how many cookies you currently have in your cookie collection. All right. Again, I already told you about the expiry date in here. All right. You can add cookies. You can retrieve cookie values, etc. This is a good example. This is very similar to the one I showed you before. You've all seen this. We may have even done this already. I don't know. But you go to a website and you want to make sure that, let's say the person has to log in. Let's just assume they have to log in. All right. Then in the upper right-hand corner, you might say, hello, Tiffany, up there, but after Tiffany is logged in. All right. And if you want it to persist, okay, then you might make it a persistent cookie. So even if she logs out and logs back on again, it'll still say that. All right. Do you want that? Not typically with anything where you want to log in, but you could do it that way. And that's what they're talking about here. And again, as I mentioned, deleting a persistent cookie, you just give it a time that's in the past. That's all you have to do. You could have add seconds, that could be add years, add minutes. It wouldn't matter because that time's already passed. All right. Enabling and disabling cookies. That talks about going into your browser. You do it different with different types of browsers. All right. If you've never done this before, it's actually worth your time. And it doesn't matter if you're using Firefox or IE. The methods for doing it are similar. But if you look in here, this says block all cookies. The other end is to allow all cookies. And by default, you'll be right in the middle. And that's typically where you want to be. All right. But if you're getting spammed a lot, or if you've got bit where, a lot of people do that, they block all cookies. They block everything. That may mean that there's something that somebody sends to you that you don't get. It may not even make its way into your, into your junk file, your garbage folder, whatever it is. So they tell you how to do it in IE, how do you do it in Chrome, how to do it in Firefox. All right. The chapter is a little longer than I thought, so it's 135. Let's come back at 150, and we will finish up with talking about URL encoding. Then we'll go into the first exercise.